Hello, my name is Colin Swider. I'm a PhD candidate at Syracuse University in the Bioacoustics and Behavioral Ecology Lab headed up by Dr. Susan Parks. For pretty much all of my research, I work in conjunction with the Elephant Listening Project, which is part of the Center for Conservation Bioacoustics at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And today I'm going to be introducing some of our work, in particular, how forest elephants respond to poaching events in terms of their landscape use. So I'm working on this project with Christopher Gemelli, Susan Parks at Syracuse University, and Peter Regg at Cornell. At the Elephant Listening Project, we study African forest elephants, Loxodonta cyclotis, which are one of the 3 remaining species of elephant, along with African savanna elephants and Asian elephants. So forest elephants are a distinct species from savanna elephants. They're smaller in size, they have different reproductive biology, behavior, and ecology, and they inhabit the rainforests of the Congo Basin in Central Africa. They are threatened with extinction, primarily due to poaching. And forest elephants are what we consider a cryptic species because they're very difficult to observe visually. They inhabit these remote, dense, lowland forests, and that makes accessibility for humans and visual observation very difficult. So it's very challenging to estimate population size and population trends, and basically to study anything about forest elephants is a challenge. So we have to employ alternative methods for studying them, such as passive acoustic monitoring, and that's exactly what we do at the Elephant Listening Project. So we're currently working with a grid of 50 acoustic sensors in Nabali-Ndoki National Park in the Republic of Congo near the border with the Central African Republic. Each of these black dots is a recorder that is hanging in the canopy of the forest, and they are spaced on average about 5 kilometers apart from one another in a randomized systematic grid. The area covered by the grid is approximately 1,250 square kilometers, and it covers both the national park itself as well as these adjacent former logging concessions. Most of the sensor sites fall into 2 major habitat types, either mixed forest with a variety of tree species or Gilbertodendron dominated forest. And we estimate that we can detect elephant vocalizations in this habitat at a range of around 500 to 600 meters from each sensor, and gunshots at a range of around 1,200 meters. So these sensors, considering that they're about 5 kilometers apart from one another, they're not set up for the purposes of localization because we won't detect a given signal at multiple sensors. Instead, when we detect an elephant vocalization or a gunshot, we assign that detection to the area around that sensor, rather than triangulating to an exact position. So these sensors have been recording continuously since the end of 2017. So we're coming up on almost 3 years of continuous data. And with 50 sensors, that means that we're right now approaching about 1.3 million hours of continuous audio recording data. So it really is a massive undertaking, definitely the most extensive project ever undertaken by the Elephant Listening Project, and probably one of the most extensive terrestrial passive acoustic monitoring applications attempted by anyone for that matter. And, I want to give a big shout out to our very dedicated Wildlife Conservation Society acoustics team that goes out every few months and does a massive circuit through the grid, visiting each and every one of those sensors, climbing trees, swapping out the memory cards and the batteries with new ones so that we have a continuous record of what's going on in this forest, in this park. Notably, I want to mention Onasi Samba, Fael Malonga, and Frelsi Abambi, who put in just astronomical amounts of time and effort to keep this grid up and running. Thank you so much, guys. Keep up the good work. These guys are going to be giving a talk of their own here shortly. A few talks from right now at 16:30, I do believe. So be sure to check that out if you are interested. And you'll learn from their talk and also from Bobby Estabrook's talk tomorrow morning, I believe it is, that there are quite a few kind of sub-projects that the Elephant Listening Project is carrying out using this grid of acoustic recorders in Nabali-Ndoki. But one of the questions that I'm really most interested in, and that I think would also be valuable for conservation, is how forest elephants respond to poaching. So for those individual elephants who are not killed outright by poaching, but that perhaps witness it and survive, or that hear gunshots from a distance, how do they respond? Do they avoid areas where poaching occurs? And what is the temporal scale and the spatial scale of that response, if there is one? So I would expect some sort of avoidance response by forest elephants for a couple of reasons. One, poaching is essentially their form of predation. So it represents a severe form of danger and risk of death. And two, these are highly intelligent animals with excellent memories. So their ability to learn and remember that humans and sounds such as gunshots represent danger is probably quite good. So to me, it seems like there's a theoretical rationale for how and why elephants would recognize gunfire as danger and respond accordingly, potentially by abandoning or avoiding nearby sites and moving into areas farther from where the event took place. This would have implications that can be thought about in an optimum foraging theory framework. So animals must balance conflicting needs for obtaining resources like food while also maintaining an adequate level of safety. So, do elephants avoid areas of high poaching pressure and thereby forego otherwise suitable or highly productive habitats? If so, this could mean that in addition to the outright killing of forest elephants through poaching, poaching could also have these indirect population level consequences, such as reduced energy intake and reduced reproductive success. So to begin looking at this question, we first need to identify if forest elephants respond to poaching events at all, either by changing their activity or their distribution across the landscape. The first step in this process is to identify potential poaching events. So to do this, we use a detector algorithm that searches the raw audio data from the grid and pulls out signals that it classifies as gunshots. These then have to be manually verified by humans, as there are things like snapping tree limbs that confuse the detector algorithm. So once those non-gunshots are weeded out, I then look for the automatic weapon fire events only, as opposed to single action weapons. So from working with the Wildlife Conservation Society and the anti-poaching teams in Nabali and Doki, we have high confidence that automatic AK-47 bursts are typically elephant kills. So in an effort to keep the analysis focused on elephant poaching instead of illegal hunting in general, I limited my analysis to automatic weapon events. And I'll play one of these now so you can get an idea of what that sounds like. This is an AK-47. So I'll be incorporating more of these events into the next round of analyses, but for this presentation, I'm currently just showing results from the first 3 events that I analyzed. The next step in this process is to identify the elephant detections before and after each of those gunshot events at the sites throughout the grid. So in particular, we're looking for vocalizations known as rumbles, and rumbles are these low frequency harmonic calls that typically have some energy in the infrasonic range below the range of human hearing. Because they're so low in frequency, they travel quite far and they suffer less attenuation in the forested environment than other types of vocalizations. So I'll quickly just play one of these so you can get an idea of what rumbles sound like. So to find these rumbles in our massive continuous audio data set, we again use a detector algorithm based on feature extraction and classification that searches the raw audio, but this time it's trained on rumbles instead of gunshots. And then just like the gunshot detector, we have to manually go through these supposed rumble detections and verify that they're actually elephants as opposed to things like thunder, insect buzzes, and flapping of bird wings. So considering we don't yet know at what temporal scale the elephants might respond to gunshot events, we limited the analysis of elephant detections to the 24 hours before and the 24 hours after each gunshot event. We figured that if we're going to find a response, that response is most likely to be concentrated in the time period just immediately after the poaching event. So I did a before-after type analysis using these 48-hour periods centered on each gunshot event. Here are some of the qualitative results from those. This is a heat map showing the elephant detections from those 24-hour periods, with the darker purple indicating more elephant detections. The yellow blast symbol indicates the site of the AK-47 gunfire. So also, if there is a response, we don't yet know the spatial scale at which this response might occur. So what we did was we truncated the grid and limited our analyses to sites closer to the poaching incident. So this decision was based on estimates of the average daily travel distance of forest elephants from a few GPS collaring studies that were done. So by reviewing those studies, we realized it probably wouldn't be appropriate to include the entire grid because any potential signal of elephant response could get diluted or washed out if the response doesn't include the far reaches of the grid, which it likely does not. So truncating it to a local area will allow us to detect a response should it occur. So looking at this heat map, there does seem to be a change in either elephant distribution or in their vocal activity, but it really isn't obvious whether or not that change is related to the poaching incident. So when I look at this, I don't see a clear pattern of avoidance, for example. Here are the heat maps from the other two events. Again, you can see a change in activity, but it isn't clear whether the change is in any way associated with the gunshot event. So in order to establish whether or not the change is actually related to the poaching incident, we are doing a couple things. First, we're using several control periods to establish a baseline for normal elephant activity that occurs when there are no gunshots at all throughout the entire grid. So we use those control periods or that baseline to compare to the gunshot event periods to see if the gunshot event results in a change from normal activity. Second, I'm analyzing this data quantitatively in a dynamic occupancy modeling framework. And I've just recently started digging into this data using the occupancy models. I do think that this is a good analytical framework necessary to elucidate any patterns that we can't see just by looking at these heat maps. I'm not quite ready to share those preliminary quantitative results yet, nor do I have the time to do so in this presentation, but I will just give a brief outline of what exactly we are modeling. What we're doing is using all of the elephant detections to model the probability of site abandonment and site colonization as a function of distance to the poaching event site. And one of our hypotheses is that the elephant's response to the poaching event includes a change in distribution across the landscape. So if elephants are truly leaving and avoiding the sites where poaching occurs, we would predict the following patterns when there is a gunshot event. We would expect that sites close to the gunshot event would have a high probability of abandonment, and that probability would decrease with distance from the gunshot site. In contrast, we would expect that sites close to the gunshot event would have a low probability of site colonization or of elephants moving into those sites, because elephants aren't going to want to be moving into this area where this poaching event just occurred. But we would expect that probability of site colonization to increase as you move farther away from the gunshot site where the elephants might be relocating to. Unfortunately, I don't really have the time right now to get into this in any more detail, but I'm happy to discuss it further if anybody's interested in this modeling approach, and if anybody wants to set up a Zoom chat or potentially get in touch via email. Unfortunately, we can't just meet up by the coffee and refreshments table this time around, but with any luck, we can do so next year. So with that, I'd really like to thank several people and institutions that have helped in various regards, including with funding and with logistical support, both in the field and in the lab. I'd like to thank Lisa Yang, Terry Brinsick, Onasi Samba, Fail Malonga, Frel Siabambi, Liz Rowland, along with the NDSEG Fellowship Program, the American Society for Engineering Education, Syracuse University Graduate Fellowship Program, the Born Free Foundation, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and our partners, the Wildlife Conservation Society. And I would also like to thank all of you for tuning in and giving me your attention. Thank you again.